Good morning. My name is Noel Power, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the Windows Search Protocol. So I've given a couple of talks on this subject previously. I've done a couple of prototypes, and I guess this talk, I'm calling it Reboot because, well, I haven't done a lot with it recently, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And yeah, just if you've been to one of these talks before, you're probably going to hear a lot of stuff that you've heard already. So it's more, I guess, a status update and what's going on at the moment and what I hope will happen in the future. So I didn't prepare an agenda slide, unfortunately. So my plan is I'm just going to give a brief overview of the Windows Search Service for those of you who don't know anything about it. Then I'm going to talk about something called WSP Search, which is a CLI program that I've written that I'm trying to upstream at the moment. So there's a merge request for that. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the Windows Search prototypes that I've worked on in the past and what's the state of those and where they're going to go. So hopefully this will be a short and painless talk. I normally do a demo with this stuff, so I mean there's nothing really new here. I can, if people are interested at the end, do a kind of an impromptu demo. I have some virtual machines loaded up on this, and I can sort of tempt the demo gods by doing an impromptu demo, and let's see if I'll crash and burn. But only if people are interested in doing that. We'll see if there's any questions, or if we have time, I hope to be finished early. So, and yeah, we'll see what happens when we get there. So, the Windows Search Service, what is it? What does it do? Why would you even want it? Basically, on a Windows machine, you can run this Windows Search Service, and you can point it at any content, any storage locations on your device. In particular, it's useful if you point it at something that's shared on the network, and what it'll do is it'll just see what files that are there, it'll iterate them and pull out any relevant metadata and build an index from that. So for example, if you've got photographs or music files, it will, in the case of music files, you could afterwards do a search and say, show me all of my music that's got the genre jazz or rock or whatever, or look at photographs from a particular date or with, you know, a particular resolution, or, you know, any of the metadata that's been indexed, you could search based on that. It is, however, focused on, in particular, on you know, full text search, natural language type queries and stuff like that. Obviously, if you want to run a query over the network, there needs to be some way for you to bundle up that query and throw it across the wire to the server. The alternative is you do this over SMB, for example, and find out what files of the particular type. If you use the example of music and you're searching for a particular genre, you're going to have to do some sort of a scoped search request on the storage location, identify the particular music files, enumerate those files, visit each of them and pull some number of bytes from them in order to pull in the music example, say if it's MP3, to pull the ID tree tags from it, get the genre information and decide whether this file is relevant to your query, etc., etc. So this eliminates all of that. You just bundle the query, shove it across the wire, the server does it and gives you all the results back. As I said, it uses SMB. I didn't say, but I should have said it uses the SMB pipe protocol, so it's kind of like RPC. It has its own pipe, and it's kind of more or less, the protocol itself is more or less a simple request response type protocol. It's got, actually, I'm not sure how many messages there are involved. I think there's between 15 and 20. And those messages are built up of between 50 to 60 structures, some of which are highly recursive. So it's a bit dense that way. So just this title of this talk is Reboot. I think the last time I presented this, I presented an Elasticsearch prototype in 2020, I think. And in the interim period, really, I haven't done too much beyond try to keep some of the branches going and keep them building against master or whatever. And I have quite a lot of branches. Some of them I have no idea what I was even doing at this stage. So recently, I suppose sometime before Christmas, I kind of was doing a bit of housekeeping, and I was looking at all these branches and said, what am I going to do with them? So I decided at least I would try and make a real effort to upstream some of this stuff. So I opened up a merge request for the WSP search client, which is the client side of this. But however, in order to provide a client functionality, there's obviously a whole lot of common functionality that would be needed for a server implementation as well. So this is kind of a prerequisite for the future server work that I hope will happen. So it's kind of like my number one priority is this, in this subject area anyway, is to get this client part of it merged. I suppose coincidentally around the same time, so I opened this as a draft request, and for those of you who are developing on in Samba, sometimes drafts sort of last forever unless you have a bit of pressure to sort of make the leap forward. So coincidentally around the same time that I opened up this request and I had it as draft, a number of people from the community, maybe it was because they saw the merge request, I don't know, or maybe it just was pure coincidence, but a number of people contacted me or reached out to know what was the state of the WSP work that I had done and those prototypes that I had presented in the past. So I did a little bit of effort to, excuse me, make at least the Elasticsearch prototype once again more buildable than it was, and so there was a version there based off Samba 4.17 that I sort of gave out to a number of people to try. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But just going back to the WSP search client that I'm trying to upstream, obviously when this is there, you're going to need some way to specify a query. If you look up on Google or whatever and ask it, or maybe chat, whatever, GPC. If you ask it, how do you get or specify a query to WSP, it tells you you've got these four mechanisms. So there's advanced query syntax, Windows Search SQL, natural query syntax, and this thing called Search MS protocol. Basically, with the exception of the natural query syntax, they're all just ways of specifying property value relationships joined together with logical operations and forming up a query in some way. So randomly, I just chose to use some sort of variation of this AQS query syntax because I found a page that kind of documented it in the first search that I did, and it's kind of easily readable, or it is to me anyway, at least. So yeah, so this is what I ended up with. I didn't end up quite with this AQS thing because there doesn't seem to be a way to specify what results you actually want back, so I ended up using some sort of a weird hybrid of WSP SQL and AQS. So I have this, you can specify your query with a select statement followed by a number of columns that you're interested in getting back, and then there's a where clause that connects the AQS part of it. Other things that I found in this documentation were how to specify enums, which are associated with properties, which, as you can see, seems quite verbose, so I didn't do that, and I just used keywords instead. And if you're familiar with the Windows Search ribbon, these loosely sort of match, the drop-downs that you have to filter your results, say, based on a file size. So if you use that drop-down, you'll get options like empty, huge, massive, gigantic, whatever. So they're just translated into date ranges in the SQL AQS mumbo jumbo stuff that I have there. So when this all hopefully gets upstreamed, you're going to be able to do a WSP search with these variations. So you specify user password as normal. You can specify kind, and again, this reflects what you'd see in the Windows UI. Kind is the type of object or document that you're interested in searching. They're enumerated there in the first line. I'm not going to go through them all. So you can search for a specific kind of document, picture, music, etc. You can specify a kind and a search phrase. So that would be some sort of natural language gubbins that you throw at it, and it will hopefully give you some sort of results back. Or you can use this AQS query. Actually, looking at the slide there, you can see there's no select or where. I probably should have had another example that has that. If you drop those, because they're not strictly necessary, it just will decide that you want the URL. So obviously there's no need for the select or the where. One thing I wanted to mention about the changes that I'm trying to upstream is that, if you recall earlier, I said that there are some massive amount of structures, highly recursive, blah, blah, blah. Some of these structures, though, cause some challenges to our IDL compiler and make it loop uncontrollably until it becomes a quivering mess, and you can't, can't even use your machine, and you need to hard power it down to continue. Or that's at least what happened to me. So I think previously I tried to upstream some of the changes to the IDL compiler, but there were some, I suppose, concerns. So I suppose trying to get roadblocks out of the way, I've just removed those definitions, and now the IDL associated generated code is now done manually in one case. In another case, I kind of avoid the situation by not making the structure as recursive as the definition says, because I have seen no instance of it in the wild using the amount of recursion that you could put in it. So there's, just to explain, there's a particular type. It's kind of an opaque type that can contain any other type, and one of those types is itself. But in any of the searches that are generated from the Windows Explorer UI, you don't see that level of recursion. So I eliminated it. I still haven't seen any issue with that. So that's just another way to avoid the particular IDL changes that I'm talking about. Moving on, the server. So the big takeaway from this is there was a tracker prototype, and it was, I feel like I'm sort of describing some sort of fairy tale. You know, once upon a time there was a tracker prototype, and there was an Elasticsearch prototype. But the tracker one, I've decided to abandon that for a number of reasons. Not in any sort of order of importance or anything like that. The first reason, which I don't even have there, is that on the particular OS version that I'm using, I work for SUSE, so I'm using Leap. The current version of Leap that I'm using in my own development machine has Tracker 3 as default. All of the code that I had previously was based on Tracker 2 or below. It just no longer builds, so that was the first reason why I stopped. The second reason was the Tracker C API, and I think it's still the case. I did look at it in 3.0. It only allows you to forward iterate through the results. So you have a cursor, you can go forward, you can rewind it to the start, you can't. There's no sort of random access ability to get your results at any point. And obviously with something that's UI based, and certainly the Windows Explorer reaches all over the result set when you do a search. So that just doesn't work. I used to get around this by caching results, and then you had to limit the results, and then obviously that's going to eventually cause all sorts of scalability problems. So that's probably one of the most important reasons why I've dropped it. Also, the Tracker Sparkle variation that I was using, I found Tracker Sparkle and that whole RDF stuff that it's using really confusing, and I found it really hard to create queries that matched the requirements that are there. A third reason is Tracker is really complex to set up. I don't believe it has changed, that it doesn't provide a system service, so you have to do all of that yourself still. I may be wrong, but I've pointed to the Spotlight page in the GNOME wiki, or in the Samba wiki, which goes through the instructions of what you need to set it up for Spotlight, and it's exactly the same setup needed more or less for the Tracker prototype. So you got to set up all the files, some wrapper scripts, special user, etc., etc. It's a bit of a pain. So other kind of issues with the server side is, I just kind of mentioned that the generation of the query is problematic for Tracker, but this is also the case in Elasticsearch. It's obviously full text search targeted also, and that's a subject matter in its own and has its own vocabulary. I'm not really familiar with that. There are so many ways that you can express a query, and obviously they all have advantages and disadvantages. And this actually kind of caused me a bit of analysis paralysis for a while, because I wasn't confident in my own ability to produce or lock in a query variation and be happy that that's the way it is. So one of the things that's come out of that is, I think really that needs to be something that the administrator or whatever can influence themselves rather than me. So it makes life obviously easier, because you just concentrate on the server functionality as such, provide some boilerplate query translation, and give the ability then to people to extend that. So associated with that, entry ID is something that the Explorer UI queries always requests, and there's a requirement that this entry ID is a 32-bit number which represents the unique documents in the index and or the query, so the server obviously has to do some sort of mapping between this ID and some sort of identifier that identifies the documents in your active results. So, there's this ID generation and recycling kind of task needs to be done there. Obviously, that's going to affect scalability later as well. And on the scalability side of things, so I'm using currently in the prototypes a single instance of the WSP server. It doesn't have any kind of monitoring facility. So, for example, and I mean, of course, it wouldn't happen because the code is so perfect. Obviously, if there was a crash, you just have to restart your SMBD instead of it detecting it and auto restarting it. So one of the things that happened, as of course I didn't do anything and Samba kept on growing, is the DC RPC microservice architecture happened, which meant then that all of my server code would no longer build, because obviously the code that I had was based on RPC stuff. I will stress again, the WSP server is not an RPC server, but it does use the pipe stuff, which the RPC code in Samba is all built around. So when that stuff changed, I had to actually create more code and figure out how the DC RPC stuff worked. And actually, this is really what the WSP server needs. So that the DC RPC microservice architecture provides the ability for those services to be started on demand, restarted, cater for scaling up when you've got more client requests. It'll spawn off more instances of the associated services. So that's kind of exactly the kind of thing that is needed. And when I first discovered that nothing would build anymore because this thing hit master, I tried to shoehorn my code into the existing DC RPC stuff, and I kind of managed to do it. And it wasn't that many changes to do it, but this stuff still isn't RPC, and it doesn't really quite match So I don't know, maybe I can convince, there he is, Walker, to allow me to shoehorn in some code, or maybe some of this stuff could be split out, or maybe I'll eventually have to actually provide the same functionality myself. But anyway, that's basically what you need. I did mention earlier that there was some interest in the prototypes. So I want to say a big thanks to Case, who's actually here, and Hemeth, who both have been testing this for the last month or so, or testing at least this older prototype that I had. So Case is a really cool situation where he's using this in a real more production-like environment, I would say, than anything that I would do, because I just test things in the simplest way possible. So I'm using an unencrypted anonymous connection. I was also using Elasticsearch. I didn't even know that OpenSearch existed, so apparently Elasticsearch was forked at some stage, because not all of the features in Elasticsearch are free. So the majority of the code is in a repo somewhere, it's on open source, but some of it is paid for. And of course, there are some of the more interesting things like document security. So you can document and user-related authorization tasks are part of the security plugin in Elasticsearch, which is a paid-for component. And you need that if you want to properly access filter the results that you're going to get back. So there's a bit of the description of the sort of setup that Case is using. I think one of the things with the WSP server is that we don't handle, or I don't handle, user authentication at the moment. So in a production environment, that might not be the best way to go. So Case is a nice way around that. He's using a proxy server to bounce the anonymous connection out to Elasticsearch as an authenticated, encrypted one. So Hemeth then he's working for Nutanix, and apparently they see some potential in this and would be interested in deploying it on their deployments going forward, if it ever sort of gets past the stage that it's at the moment. So again, thanks to the guys for testing it. It's great for me to get a bit of validation that actually somebody thinks that some of this stuff is useful, rather than, just kind of playing around with it and it never going anywhere. So let's assume that the client stuff gets in. What would be the goal of the next step server? Well, always my focus was just supporting these basic Window Explorer queries, because that's how I reckon most people are going to use this. Or the other thing is, like I said, query mapping is complex and demands skills that I don't think that I particularly have. And when you allow people to do stuff themselves, they are very creative and can do things that you never thought of. So there's a bit of a two-edged sword, I suppose, in a security point of view. But I think you need to be able to allow this to be configured and allow those conversions to be built by the administrator or whatever. So also you need, obviously, these entry IDs support scalability, and the real missing one as well is user authentication, because that enables the features that are involved with access filtering to happen. So the corollary of this is what it won't do. So it will never provide full Windows Search Protocol functionality, and that was always the way. There are too many tie-ins with the specifics of the Windows side of things. Some of these restrictions are obviously targeted at the Windows Search service itself and the peculiarities that it has. There are some guarantees about result content that are there. I think as long as a query is open, it says in the protocol anyway at least, that if you try to retrieve results at any point within that result set, they're guaranteed always to be the same. But I mean, we don't hold a query open, or I don't hold a query open. The query is run every time when you want to iterate the results, but the index won't change anyway unless you actually run something on it and push results into the index, so it kind of probably wouldn't happen anyway. And then things like access filtering, I used to try and do this in the prototype, but I think it's not really the job of the WSP server to do it, it's the job of the back end, the real indexer, the Elasticsearch or OpenSearch in this case is the thing that should do the access filtering, and it's up to somebody to be able to set that up in the appropriate way that it provides that. But again, you obviously would need proper user authentication in order to configure that correctly. So, of course, what happens? You do another prototype. So I've started working on another one. This is the, I suppose, feature set in that it does support Windows Explorer. There is a Python plugin, so all of the conversions that were done before in the C code is all done now in Python. Actually, the prototype does it side by side, so I can test both and see that it's giving the same results. It does support the synthesized IDs. User authentication isn't done. Scalability, also not done. I think user authentication can be done in a simple way, you know, like some of the existing features where we do, or there is the ability to do some sort of user map or whatever. That's already kind of done in some situations in SMB anyway, and those credentials could be stored using SMB password or whatever. In terms of scalability, I did mention that trying to get the kind of functionality that DCRPC microservice architecture provides, that's the ultimate goal, but even as a first step, making sure that the service gets restarted if it dies would be a first step, and then, you know, leave it remain like it is at the moment, which is just a single service, and then we can build the extra scalability parts in later. Like it has to be said that if you enable the WSP protocol, for example, on the Windows server, a message does come up to say that this is only suitable for desktop environments or small office environments. So, you know, the scalability doesn't have to be massive. But the other side of that, though, is that the back end, Elasticsearch or OpenSearch, is highly scalable and is enterprise ready. So, you know, the extra bit of scalability in terms of making it a bit more like DCRPC should allow that to happen pretty easily, and it should scale up. And that's it. Questions? If you have any. Nope. Good. Good luck.
Noel, you mentioned access filtering. Is that that I can't find the files in your home directory, or is that so?
Really, it's just you. If you own files and you do a search, for example, like a full text search on the content, you can imagine if all of the documents are indexed and just available to one user, and you look for, I want my boss's salary or something like that, then you're going to get that information back, and the access filtering should ensure that only results that you are entitled to.
Yeah, exactly. So I can't find the files on your home directory or on the finance share or whatever. Yeah.
So Elasticsearch and OpenSearch do provide document and index level security. I'm not entirely sure how you set that up.
Yeah, but how would you map that with access permissions in Samba? So I can have share access permissions, but home share is one share, and then the subdirectory is my home directory.
Yeah, but you're talking about two different things, right? So one, is the permission to actually index the content, and the other thing is the permission to actually access that index content. So the access of it is really the job of the server, or the back end in conjunction to provide a single solution. The indexing is a separate task.
Yeah, the indexing will index everything probably.
Yeah, but it's somewhat out of band of this because, okay, at the moment everybody I think is probably using FS Crawler. I use FS Crawler in my own sort of setup of it, but there's nothing to mandate that you have to use that. There's nothing that says that's how you populate the index. And that's the reason, one of the other reasons why you need this to be quite configurable, because the solution at the moment, if it was hard-coded, is based on the fact that FS Crawler is the thing that populates the index in a specific way using specific properties named in a specific way, etc., etc. So, but I mean, there's nobody saying that Elasticsearch or OpenSearch doesn't say you have to use this thing to populate my index. You can populate it whatever way you want with whatever tools are available. What tools are available? That's something I don't have a huge amount of knowledge about. Apparently there's Apache have, and the Tiki crowd, which are the things that provide the scrapers that FS Crawler use, have this functionality called Tiki pipes that they're developing, which is which does provide the functionality that FS Crawler does in terms of crawling the files and pushing the data into Elasticsearch or OpenSearch. I haven't tried it, I don't know what it does. And like you discovered, there are issues with FS Crawler and the way that it populates the database. So for example, if you went back to one of these slides here, looking at the kinds of things here, one of these is a folder. So you can search in a folder type. Now FS Crawler indexes content of your files into one index that you configure, and it indexes all folders into a different index. Okay, so when you're trying to create a query, and at the moment types, the way that types are done, the query assumes that each file that each kind that you're trying to search is matched to a MIME type. So there is no MIME type information pushed into this folder index. In fact, I think the only thing that's in there is just the name of the folder, and that's it. So at the moment, you try and search for a folder in my prototype, you're just not going to get any results back. Now, somebody could probably specify a query in such a way to use this extra index, but it's not really worth my effort to customize for one particular,
But filter out the results that don't belong to me. That is probably part of the search.
Well, it's part of what OpenSearch / Elasticsearch provides if you configure it correctly. You can configure user roles. You can use those user roles then to control access to either document specific content in the index or the index itself. So you can say this user is not allowed to use this particular index, or this user is not allowed to use documents with, I don't know. I think one of the ways that it does it is you can, in FS Crawler, for example, you can specify that user and group IDs are part of the index information, and you can, there's in some sort of dynamic query addendum that can be post-processed on the Elasticsearch side, if I understand correctly, where it will automatically,
Yeah, I understand that, but that makes the Elastic setup mimic more or less the permissions that you have on the SMB side.
There are multiple ways, I'm sure, to do it. And somebody who's probably more.
It doesn't work for ACEs, for example, or ACLs. If I disallow you to access this subtree, then Elastic can't know.
One of the things that's configurable in the query is the name of the index, and the name of the index is something that's defined in the that you're going to search is defined in the smb.com file. That index name the way that I'm using it is it uses the replacement stuff that it exists for many SMBD parameters. So for example, you could put, what is it, %u in it, and it will look in a index that's got the name of the authenticated user, for example, and you could make sure that your user role permissions are set up in such a way that only a user of this name, an authenticated user of this name, can only access an index of the name of the user, for example. That was one way you could do it. There are multiple ways that you can do it. I mean, this is obviously a problem that's already served or solved by Elasticsearch, OpenSearch, because, I mean, they're enterprise products. Like, they have to have some solution. It's just, personally, I don't know the intimate details of how to set it up correctly, because it's not really. Jeremy has a question?
So a couple of things. First of all, don't try and do the startup stuff for the DCRPC, like the DCRP. Don't do that yourself. Just try and leverage what we already have. I'm sure we can make it work.
Oh, you can make it work. It's just that it's dirty.
As long as it's not too dirty. I mean, just using the same techniques would be good, rather than having another mechanism. It was hard to get everything reviewed and in the first time, so let's just reuse what we have, as long as it's not too evil.
I have to take photos again to look at my patches.
Well, it depends. It depends what you're changing, but yeah, there may be other ways to do it.
Yeah.
But let's reuse what we have. Second thing is, I remember talking to Brad at Apple the last SDC or the SDC ago, where he said that they were standardizing on WSP search for iOS. And I wondered whether you had, do you know if their server has a WSP search implementation you can test your client against? Or have you done any packet tracing between iOS to iOS to see if...
No, I don't have. Somebody wants to donate me an iOS device.
Right. That might be interesting, because the thing is, especially when your server is running...
My laptop's a bit old.
When your test server is running, it might be good to see what kind of queries that an iOS device would create as well, so that we're not just tailoring it to Windows. Yeah.
Just to see that it actually does work. Yeah.
Yeah, I've got a bunch of iOS.
Oh, wait. Noel asked me a question, which was, oh, you have a bunch of iOS and Mac devices, and I said, yes, I do. It wasn't a question.
Okay, any other questions?
Do the demo! Yeah, let's see it. Demo.
It's not much to demo, really, as such. Nothing that you haven't seen before.
Let's see it again.
So... So here, if you can see, this is the Python stuff that's doing the query these days, and it's not actually that long, 500 lines. So it just builds the query, blah, 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 blah. Not going to really go into that too much. Yeah, I have some examples here of the search client. So here I'm just looking for documents that I have. Can I remember my password?
It's 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yes. See, I knew it.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
I should have picked an easier password, but anyway, okay, so that's the kind of thing that you get back. Or, what other ones did I have here? I had
Can you show us a wire trace?
Sure.
Is it Wireshark filter?
There is a Wireshark filter for it.
You just tell me what your password is later, I'll remind you of it.
Mm-hmm. If you're interested in the protocol, that's the named thingy for it. So the search that I just did. Okay, this is a different search. I'm looking for a free-form phrase. Let's see what it comes up with. And we should have some. Oh, no, we don't. Okay, it's probably on the wrong. Let me. Let me try loop back. Ugh. Okay, I think we got something that time. Okay, so here you can just see some of the messages, and this is kind of the interesting one where it's getting back the results. So if we expand that. So on this one, because there's only one column coming back, which is your URL, that's that. I should have some other ones that have some other variations. Let me see what I have here. Okay, so this one is just showing the entry ID that's been generated. And
Is that tool songs or what is it?
which?
I saw some MP3s look like tool songs.
No, absolutely not.
Sorry.
So it's not giving me back an entry ID, so I wonder, have I broken that? I probably have. But you could maybe get a date, and we'll see that in the results set. Ooh. What have I done? Date created. Here's one I prepared earlier. So this time we should have a couple of more columns. And actually, so this one here, it's not showing an entry ID. And if you don't, you can, one of the good things about the Windows Search protocol is that it's kind of forgiving in terms of how it allows you to do things. So you can say, you know, I don't understand this property and I can't give it back to you. So there's a status here. If you can see, it's store status null, just means we don't have it. So in this case, an important property like this, having it missing, makes no difference to my simple client, but if it's missing on the Windows side, it's not very happy about it. Let me get Windows machine up. Oops. And we'll just start the okay, so we go into the share and we do the same search. I think I searched for music the last time, so we could do the same thing here. So here's the drop downs that I was talking about. Where's music? Here. So without the entry ID, when you click something, you get a nice effect like this. So you can't select anything really. It's really. So missing data, although from the protocol side doesn't really do anything when you're actually trying to use it. If you don't have the right stuff, things don't work quite as you expect. So I think actually, if I remember correctly, I removed the entry ID in order to show this to somebody, but then forgot about it. So that's why it's no longer there. It's not that it's actually broken. I have removed it. Anything else?